So let's start today, the second day of our PMP exam prep step by step. Let's recap a bit about what we did yesterday. After we discussed the structure of the course and what is involved in obtaining PMP certification, we looked at what is a project, we looked at what is a project management, and why we need project management. And after that, we discussed about program, portfolio, and projects and how they fit in together in an organizational environment. Today, we'll continue with the introduction chapter of the PMP, and we'll start with the first topic that we'll touch upon is life cycle, phases, and processes. Now, life cycle, when we talk about life cycle is really a sequence of phases. So what we have is, let's say this is a timeline, and a project, when we have a project, let's say the first phase we do is the starting the project, organizing and preparing, carrying out the work, and then end the work. So this is a typical life cycle, a project life cycle. Now let's take an example. Now let's take an example and see how it fits together in a project and how different phases work together. So as an example, I'm taking a, let's say, system. We are developing a system. So in developing the system, the first phase probably will do initiate the project. And a lot of times what we do when we initiate a project, we will go and do feasibility study before we embark on the project. So we do the feasibility study, and that is the initiation of the project. After the feasibility study, provided it has been approved, then we move into the requirements and planning. We plan for the schedule, we plan the cost, we plan the scope, we do the requirements, and this is done, after which we move to the next phase. Typically, the next phase will be construction and development, which probably will comprise of actual designing the system, and after designing, actually working on the developing the system, and this is what we say carrying the work. And once that phase is finished, we go into the implementation phase before we hand it over to the production. So these are what we are seeing is a string of phases, a sequence of phases that makes up the project lifecycle. Now, when we look at these phases, there are three kinds of sequence that can happen. One, these phases, they can be sequential. When we say sequential, it means that one phase will get over, after which another phase will start, and so on and so forth. But instead of sequential, sometimes we can have overlapping phases. Even before one of the phase is over, we can probably start another phase. Let's say you are constructing a hotel, and that is your project. So after most of the building, construction of the building is done, and let's say you have two phases. One is actual construction of the facility of the building, and another is the construction of the landscape or landscaping, which is the next phase. So what you can probably do after around 80% of the work is done on the construction, even though it is not finished, you can start with the landscaping. And so there is an overlap between the first phase and the second phase. So in such a case, what we're saying is overlapping phases. Project life cycle has overlapping phases. Compared to that, there is another type of relationship between the phases, which is iterative. Iterative is one of the phase gets over and then the next phase gets done, then the first phase again takes over and so on till it is finished. So sometimes what you'll do is, let's say in the iterative case, you have done the development, you have done the testing, again you have done the development, again there's the testing, and you go in iteration before you finish with the project. So there are different kinds of relationship of phases in a project life cycle. So what we're seeing here is different phases for what we've seen is, let's say as an example, here we are saying starting the project, organizing and preparing, carrying out the work, ending the work. Now, in this particular life cycle, we looked at phases from a perspective sequence of events that goes in. But phases, a project can be broken down into phases in many different ways, and it can depend on various factors. Maybe the timeline, maybe the funding that happens, or maybe the milestone, maybe the usability. So different factors can come in to decide how we break a project into different phases. Now, when we see this project life cycle with different phases, one after another, that finishes the project, one of the things that will come is phase gate. Phase gates are the points at the end of each phase. Now, why is it so important, these phase gates? Because typically what will happen at the end of the phase, at the phase gate, there will be some action taken. Maybe review will take place, maybe there will be go, no-go decision, and so on. For example, a lot of times after the feasibility study, you will decide if the next phase should happen or not happen, depending on if what we're looking for is feasible or not feasible, or how feasible it is. So the approach you will take will be different based on what has been found out from this particular phase. So phase gate can be important decision points. Now, life cycles, there are different types of life cycles. Probably the most known life cycle is the predictive or waterfall methodology, we call it. This is the traditional one. This is the classic one that we knew, where everything is being done before. For example, the way it will work is you will finish off all the requirements, you will tighten the requirements, you will get an approval for the requirements, and then move into the next phase, let's say development. So what really happens here is one of the big assumptions in the predictive methodology or waterfall methodology is that we know exactly what we need. We know exactly what we need, and we don't expect anything to change as we move through the project. And so it is more plan driven. We plan it, we have a very tight plan in terms of scope, time, and cost, and then we move through the project. And therefore, changes have to be carefully managed because of our assumption that the requirements are fixed, we have committed to this time and cost, and so if there are any changes that come in, it will jeopardize the time, the cost, commitment that we have made, and therefore the changes in case of predictive methodology typically is very, very carefully, very tightly managed. As opposed to this predictive methodology, but before going to the predictive methodology, next, let's look at how it looks, the predictive methodology. That's in the predictive methodology or waterfall methodology, what really happens is we start a project and we plan, we find out the requirements, we develop, and then we deliver. A straight line because we know what is required. As opposed to the predictive, we can also have iterative methodology. Iterative methodology, one of the assumptions is that we have an opportunity to improve the product, improve the quality, improve the product in iteration. Probably because we don't have the full understanding of the product, and there will be learning involved on our side, on the business side, as we move through the project, and we want to take advantage of that through iteration. Or probably it is still developing. There are many unknowns that we need to explore and discover. So what happens in an iterative life cycle? Scope is determined early, so we know the scope, what needs to be done. But we develop that through cycles. In other words, we do the part and then we check with our business, the stakeholder, our users, take more feedback, and then take another round of development. Again, check with them, get it reviewed, get it tested, until we get the final result. So in such a case, what we are saying is time and the cost can change. And so the planning will be done accordingly. This time, the cost is not fixed because we expect changes to happen as we go through the iteration process. The way it looks is, we start, and then through iteration, we develop. We develop through iteration, and finally, we deliver. So there is multiple iteration that goes on, but there is, at the end of it, there's one deliverable, once we deliver once. So this is what we call the iterative life cycle. As opposed to iterative life cycle, we have something called incremental life cycle. Now, incremental life cycle is in a way iterative, but the primary difference between the iterative is there will be multiple deliverables, and that makes sense when the user, the stakeholders, can benefit from multiple deliverables. And so and in such a case, we move into iterative or incremental life cycle. So what really happens is the deliverables are provided through successive iteration. So we make iteration and deliver, again make another iteration and deliver. So the way it looks like this: we start, we develop through iteration, and we deliver. We develop through, and we take another chunk, and we develop through iteration, we deliver. We take another chunk of the scope, and we develop through iteration, and we deliver. So this is how the incremental life cycle will look like. It's a compared to this incremental, we also have something called adaptive, which really is, when we say adaptive, it really means agile, iterative, or incremental. And agile really is iteration with a much shorter time period. So that's what will be agile, and we'll have. And so when we say adaptive, it can mean agile, iterative, or incremental. Oftentimes, detailed scope are defined before, and then it is passed through iteration. So the scope will be before the iteration, the scope will be defined and approved, and then the iteration will take place to provide a quality output. We also have something called hybrid, because a lot of times what you'll find in a project, there will be phases where you might want to use what you call the predictive methodology, because you know exactly what needs to be done. We don't need to go through the iterative cycle. And in another area where it is evolving, you might want to use the iterative or incremental life cycle. So it's a combination of hybrid is essentially combination of predictive and adaptive life cycle. So the parts where the requirement is fixed, we know it is not going to change, it is very clear. We'll use that part of the project, we'll use predictive life cycle. And those areas where we are not very clear and we know it will evolve as we move through the process, that will have an adaptive life cycle. Now, we have gone through the life cycle. Now, let's recap this. So, we have seen there are sequence of phases that gives us the project life cycle. And in a life cycle, there are different kinds of life cycle. It can be waterfall or predictive, or it can be incremental, it can be iterative, it can be adaptive, it can be hybrid. Now, to implement or to go through the life cycle, project life cycle, we will use processes, project management processes to actually manage the project. Now let's look at how these processes look like. Now, these processes that we'll use to actually execute the project, they are really series of management activity. Series of management activity, and it will be characterized by inputs, tools and techniques and outputs, just like any processing box or processing box where inputs come in, something happens inside the processing box and the output comes out. So in a similar fashion, a process here is also defined by input, tools, techniques and outputs. Now, but this process groups. So what you'll find here, when we look at it more detail just now, you'll have many different processes and they have been grouped. They have been grouped in terms of knowledge area, in terms of the process groups. So, but these process groups are iterative and overlapping. We'll find that the process group, there are 5 different process groups we'll come across: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. But though they may sound as if they should go in sequence, they do not. They overlap and there is an iteration between them. Now let's look at them, look at these processes more closely. First, let's look at a single process. A single process will have an input to it, or will have inputs to it. And once this input goes into this process, through the process, it will generate an output, like any process box. Now, what are the inputs? Inputs are things like organization processes, environmental factor, and outputs from other processes. We'll look at that in more detail. What is organization processes? What is the environmental factors? And many other processes will provide output which will go into this as input to this. Inside the process box, or in what kind of processing that takes place, is there will be a set of interrelated actions and activities that will take place inside the process. And when it is done that, the output that you will have maybe is the final deliverable or the project or phase, or it can be an intermediate deliverable that will be input to other process. So this is really the structure of a process. Now, we don't have to get overwhelmed because we'll go through different processes, each processes as we move through the project, and then we'll see what is really involved in terms of inputs and what is really involved in terms of outputs and what are the activities that we do in each of the processes. An overview of the processes. Now, we will have a total of 49 processes that is defined in this PMBOK guide. Now, when we say 49 processes, it doesn't mean that all our projects will have to use all these 49 processes. It is not necessary that all 49 processes has to be used. We'll tailor it according to a project, according to the organization, according to how the project is structured and so on. So it should be tailored to your project. These 49 processes are grouped into 5 process groups and 10 knowledge areas. We'll look at that in more details. Now, this is a table that gives us a clearer picture. Now, if I want to look at one page in the book, I would look at this particular page. I think it's page number 25 in the 6th edition, because it gives very clearly what are the different processes that is involved and what are the different process group. Now, if you look at this, on all the horizontal lines or horizontal rows that you see, they are the knowledge areas. For example, the green horizontal rectangle that you see is the project risk management or risk management knowledge area. All the processes within this row, works for the risk management. Basically, it is about the risk management of the project. And then in the vertical column, red column that you see, these are the process groups. Now, when we say process groups, this particular process group, the red vertical column, is executing process group, and all the processes here in this particular column is about execution of the project based on the planning that has been done in the planning process group. And if you look at the intersection, the process that intersects the green and the red rectangle, we have one process which is implement risk response. What it really means, this process is in the risk management knowledge area, and it is being used or applied in the execution during our execution of the project. Now, process groups, there are different process groups. One is the initiating process group. Initiating process group, what it really means, the processes is in this process group really is about defining the project or the phase that we are embarking on. It is how we start, is the kickoff of the project. And then we have the planning process group, which works, all the processes in the planning process group works to draw a plan of action. In fact, there will be all sorts of different plans, right? From cost management to schedule plan, to quality plan, to risk plan. All these plans will be drawn in the processes or by these processes within this planning process group. Then you have something called executing process group, where you actually execute the project, actually perform the work. So all the processes within the executing process group will work towards execution or based on the plan that you have made. And then monitoring and controlling process group is about tracking the progress. Now, this is something that can be a very bit tricky for a project manager, because as a project manager, we need to wear two hats. As the execution is going on, we have to put on the hat of the monitoring and controlling to see the execution that is going on is according to the plan that has been made. So the monitoring and controlling process group, or processes in monitoring and controlling process group, actually tracks the progress of the project based on the plan that is being made. And finally, closing process group will include processes that actually does all the administration, all the different formal administration, formal activities that is required to actually close the project, because we don't want to leave anything hanging once the project is over and project is handed over to the operation or the production. Another way to slice these processes is knowledge area. But before we go into that, let's look a little more closely in the process group. You remember we said something before. We said these process groups are overlapping and iterative. Let's see what it means. Now, if you really look at this, initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing, it sounds as if they should go in sequence, but they do not. There is an overlap and there is an iteration between the processes of these process groups. So the way it works, let's say you want to start a project or a phase. Remember, we will go through all these processes in all these process groups. If you're doing one phase project, or if we are having a project with multiple phases, then in each phase we'll have all these processes in the process groups that we're talking about. So let's say we are starting a project or starting a phase, enter a project or start a phase. So what happens? We first do the processes and we go through the processes in the initiating process group. Once we have done that, or we initiated that project or the phase, we do the planning and we use the processes for the planning in the planning process group. After the planning is done, we do an execution. Now here you see something. There is a loop, which means planning processes in the planning process group fits into the processes of the executing process group. And again, executing process group, processes in executing process group fits into processes of planning process group. So what it really means, when we go through the execution, we might find something that is not correct with the plan. Some plan needs to be adjusted, and this is why it fits back into the planning process group to make sure that plan and the execution are in sync. Once it is done, we have gone through that, we do the closing and we go through the closing processes in the closing process group. Now, you might be wondering, what happened to a monitoring and controlling process group? Well, monitoring and controlling process group really overlooks from beginning to end. And we need to have these processes in place from initiating to closing. After the closing is done, we exit the phase or end the project. Another way to look at this process overlap is to see from the lens of interaction. How much interaction is taking place at what point of time in each of this process group. So let's look at this. X-axis provides us the timeline, and y-axis provides us the level of process interaction. And if you look at this, you will see the initiating process group, most of the activities is done initially, and then it finishes pretty early on. However, the planning process group, though it starts almost the same time, but it goes for a longer period. But there is an overlap of activity between the planning process group and the initiating process group. If you look at the executing process group, it also starts early, but most of the activity is done after the planning process group is after the planning process group tapers down. So what does this mean? This executing process group actually depends on the planning process group, but there is an overlap. So you might be wondering, how come executing process group starts almost at the beginning? It can happen, especially when, let's say, when you are doing your initial work, even doing a feasibility, even trying to decide the project, you are doing some kind of prototyping, execution of some prototyping. And that's why there might be some activity at a very early stage. Of course, this is not a chart that applies to all the project, but this can be one of the activity that is happening in a project. Now, having said that, what we are really trying to emphasize here is there is an overlap of processes or activities in processes in different process group. Now, when we look at the monitoring and controlling process group, that will make sense to you from the previous slide, because monitoring and controlling process group really goes from start to finish, and closing process group again is at the end, but it starts somewhere after the midpoint, and there is an overlap with all the other process groups, excepting probably the initiating process group. So what we are trying to emphasize here is there is an overlap of processes between the process groups. Now, knowledge areas, there are 10 knowledge areas. That's what we've seen in the table, process table. Yeah, and let's look at each of them, what it means. Of course, we'll go through the processes in each of the knowledge area as we move down the line, but let's look at what each of these knowledge area comprises of. The first one we'll look at is project integration management. Now, as the name suggests, processes in this project integration management knowledge area will really integrate processes across all the other knowledge areas in this particular process group. For example, in the planning process group, you will have schedule being drawn in the time schedule management knowledge area. Then cost management plan will be drawn, cost plan, costing will be drawn, and the budget will be drawn in the cost management knowledge area. Then quality will be drawn in the quality management knowledge area. So all these different knowledge areas below it will have its own subsidiary plan. And the project integration management knowledge area, we will consolidate all this plan, or will integrate all this plan to make a one consolidated plan that will follow through as we move through the project. So typically, or basically, the processes in the integration management will look at integrating processes in different knowledge area so that we can move ahead with the project. Scope management knowledge area will look at processes where we define the requirements, define the scope, and break it down and so on. So it is about managing the scope, defining the scope that will be taken forward to actually implement. Schedule management is about the time. We will draw a schedule and we'll see what are the best way to put forward a schedule that will take it as make it our roadmap as we move through the project. Cost management knowledge area will work to determine the budget, and again there will be different processes, and we'll go step by step in determining the budget, and we'll also look at how we'll control the budget and so on and so forth. Quality management will look at the quality, and we'll again look at different processes, how we determine the quality plan, and how we keep a control and monitor the quality as we move forward. Resource management is about all kinds of resources, human resource as well as physical resources, how we obtain those resources, and how we determine what resources is required. Communication is again a very key thing, and we have a special knowledge area for communication management, because communication, we want to ensure that we are communicating adequately, we are communicating appropriately, and we are communicating to all the stakeholders that we need to. We don't want to miss out on that, because missing out on communication can really jeopardize the success of the project. Then we have the risk management. Risk management is to see what kind of unforeseen scenarios that exist in the project, and we want to mitigate any kind of risk. And we'll also see in this particular knowledge area that it's not only that we want to reduce the possibility of the downside because of negative risk, but we'll also try to capture positive risk and try to leverage on the positive risk or opportunities. Then procurement, especially where the procurement is done from outside vendors, maybe it's physical materials, maybe it's consulting resources. So whatever we do, how we go about procurement, this is what we look through in processes in the procurement management knowledge area. And finally, we look at stakeholder management, project stakeholder management knowledge area, where we'll see how to engage with stakeholders, how we effectively engage with stakeholders from beginning to end. And what we should not do is at the beginning of the project, we talk to the stakeholders, we go in our own shell and do whatever needs to be done, and at the end we'll go to talk to the stakeholder. That is not something that we should do, and we'll avoid that, because effectively engaging stakeholder improves the success of the project a great deal, and that's why there's a big emphasis on engaging stakeholders as we move through the project. Now let's put it all together. We looked at the project life cycle, we looked at phases, we looked at processes. So let's see how all of them fit together. We saw that different phases, when we move through in sequence in different phases, and it gives us the project life cycle. Now this project life cycle is comprised of different phases, and at the end of each phase there can be phase gates where there can be go, no go decision, funding, reviews, and so on and so forth. Now then we saw there are processes in different process groups. Now processes in all these process groups will facilitate our phases, how we move through phases, what we do in each of the phases. So all this process will facilitate each of the phases in the project life cycle. And we saw that there are processes across knowledge area in each of this process group. Not only here, we also saw in the process table. So this is really how it all ties up together. Processes in different knowledge area and different process group goes into facilitating different phases and different phases makes up the project life cycle. Finally, let's look at what is called the business documents. Now, as a project manager, when we come and we are provided, okay, this is what needs to be done, and we go ahead with it, we find the requirements and we develop and we deliver and so on and so forth. But then, if we really step back and think, our users, our sponsors, if they have provided us what needs to be done, they're telling us what needs to be done, they must have done something even before we stepped in. This is what we'll talk about at this point of time. So this is the project life cycle that we see from our viewpoint as a project manager. We see that we are starting the project, we are organizing and preparing a planning, we're carrying out the work, we're completing the project. But before this project life cycle starts, there are some activities that takes place which is really pre-project work, even before the project starts. So what happens over there? There, a needs assessment will be done, and that is typically done by the business, and they will find out what is the need, they assess the needs, and when they assess the need, they'll also put forward a business case. Because if a sponsor, a business needs a project, they will have to justify to the organization, to the senior management, why they need it, what is the purpose, what are they going to gain out of it. And so this is what they'll put forward, put together a business case. And from our project perspective, this is a very useful document. If you can get that document, what has been the thinking in behind this project. They'll also probably put together a benefits management plan, which will tell us how they'll manage once they get the benefit, how that needs to be managed. Now, this business case will become the precursor to the project charter. Project charter will look at project charter, but project charter is really the starting point for our project. This is when the project gets kicked off, and as a project manager, we are given the authority to start the project. And the precursor to this project charter is really the business case that was developed or that was drawn by the sponsor, by the business. Now, this project charter will then lead to project plan, project management plan. And this project planning management plan finally will drive the project. Now, let's look at what are these different business documents. One is we talked about business case. And when we talked about business case, what does it have? It will have the business needs. What is it what are the need of the business that we are trying to satisfy? That is something that they'll put forward. And then this will be derived based on the analysis of the situation. Probably some gap analysis will be done. And so this is what the current state of the business. This is what needs to be done to actually run the business more efficiently, to derive more benefits. And based on this is the need that we have in the business. And based on that, there might be some recommendation. There might be some recommendation, okay, do some incremental thing, or there might be recommendation to completely revamp how we are doing it, and so on and so forth. And then there will be an evaluation as well, which provides a maximum benefit, and so on and so forth. And so this will comprise, all these points will become the points behind the business case document. Then there will be business management plan. Many organizations, they might put together a business management plan, essentially saying that once the business is derived, how we will manage that business, how we will absorb that benefits, how we will absorb the benefits, and what kind of processes will be involved. So what it will really have is the target benefits. Now, these target benefits essentially is what is the benefit that we'll be getting out of the project, or based on the business case, or the based on what has been identified in the business case, what are the benefits we'll get out of the project. That can be tangible benefits, or this can be intangible benefits as well. Then how are these strategically aligned? How will they be strategically aligned? So once we have the benefit, we want to ensure that it has been strategically aligned the way it has been thought of. What is the time frame for realizing when, and will it be in different phases, or will it be all together? So what will be the time frame? How will it look like where the way we'll get the benefits? And who is the owner? basically who will operate, who will act on it, and who will be behind it when the benefit is actually started to getting delivered. How will we measure them? How will we measure that what kind of benefits we're getting, and the assumptions and risks that is involved in getting those benefits. So these are some of the points that will come across in the benefits management plan. So these are the two key business documents that is done or that is prepared even before the project starts. And then of course, we'll have the project charter. Project charter is, like we said, the first document that is created to kick off the project to provide the authority to the project manager. And we'll look at this, we'll have a process on this, and we'll look at it in much more details. And then, of course, the project management plan. And again, we will have one process group per se with many different plans that will come together to provide us the project management plan. So with this, we have finished this particular chapter or this first module, the integration, the introduction. And in our next module, we'll move into the environment, and we'll look at how the environment influences a project and what we need to take into consideration in the environment. So for this, we'll meet again for our next class, and that will be day after tomorrow. That will be day after tomorrow. And